If you haven't built up community, you're just setting people up to be in a vicious cycle right back into the system. If we truly want to achieve these results, we have to work to develop the supports in community so that people can thrive.
This is the Women Beyond Walls podcast, and I'm lawyer and activist Sabrina Matani. Around the world, nearly 1 million women are behind bars, and that number is rising. Often, this is not for serious crimes, but because they are poor, because they've survived violence, or because the system failed them long before a conviction. Stand up. We've got to stand up. In this second season of the podcast, I speak with women who have lived through incarceration, as well as those reimagining what justice could look like. On this episode, I have the privilege of speaking with Senator Kim Pate. Kim has spent decades working both at the front lines with marginalised women in Canada's prisons and in the halls of government, pushing for systemic change that addresses the root causes of incarceration. So given that this is the last episode of the season, I wanted to talk to her about reforms to the criminal legal system. Today we'll dive into Kim's journey, from her early work with vulnerable youth and women escaping violence to her fight for change, including her push to end solitary confinement for women through the proposed Tona's law. We'll also dig into the realities faced by women like Tona Mills, the shocking overrepresentation of Indigenous women in Canadian prisons, and the potential of community-based alternatives to incarceration. A gentle heads up. In this episode, we talk about some sensitive topics, including mental health, sexual violence, and trauma within prison. Please take care of yourself as you listen. Now, let's begin the conversation. Senator Kim, I'm thrilled to have you on the Women Beyond Walls podcast. Your work in government and in the non-profit sector has led to significant change, working with and behalf of some of the most marginalised people in Canada.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and please just call me Kim.
Thank you so much. To start off, please tell us a bit about your background and what drew you into this work.
Sure. Well, I grew up a working class kid. I went to university fairly young. I was 16 when I started out. And I went planning to go to law school to figure out a way to make money and to be able to support the folks who I knew I would need to support. Along the way, I often say I learned more about equality. I would not have said, I did not understand the context of the inequality I saw all around me growing up. Racial inequality, gender inequality, class inequality, ability inequality, all of those things. And so it was as I was going to university, and then as I started doing work with young people, and then going into prisons, because I was working first with young people who were on the margins. And although I had learned in law school that the law applied equally to everybody, it became very clear very early on that our jails are full of the people who are failed by every other system, and that it certainly isn't an equal application of the law. And particularly when it came to women, it's part of why not quite 10 years into the work, I started focusing more specifically on young women, girls, and women in the prison system. And that's when I started working with the National Office of Elizabeth Fry. All my work with women before that had been unpaid, unwaged work. It had been working with women who were escaping violence, young women who were had been in incestuous rape situations, as well as other kinds of abusive situations. And so when I started that work, then I was shocked by what women were being criminalized for, in addition to what I already knew about the injustices. I saw that women in particular were more likely to be criminalized for things that I hardly ever saw men criminalized for. And that was both charges outside and the way that police responded to women, the way prosecutors responded to women, the way the entire society responded to women, as well as how the prisons treated women. And so the accumulation of that, seeing women essentially not being treated fairly, especially women when they experience violence, if they sought the protection of society, often that wasn't there. That was all the more so for racialized and Indigenous women and women with disabilities. And so we see the majority of women that I've known over the years who have been imprisoned have largely been imprisoned because of their attempts to negotiate an inhospitable environment for them, whether it's because of poverty, racism, violence, all of the above. And so we've been working on some of those issues. And when a group of Indigenous women approached me almost 10 years ago now and urged me to consider the appointment process to our Senate, I had been working for the Elizabeth Fry Society. By the time I was appointed, it was 2 months short of 25 years. And I had been working on some of these issues in that context. And every issue we addressed in terms of a law reform issue, we also included a social, economic, and health reform component. Then we would say, in order to remedy this, it's not just changing the law, we actually have to change society and we have to change how communities support people. And so very early on, started advocating things like a guaranteed livable income, like a robust social and health system that provided the supports for people who started out in an unequal position and provided the supports for them to start in a more equitable position than they already were. And argued that, similar to what we've seen in some of the Scandinavian countries and in other pockets in the world, that when we see a more equal, really fundamentally equal society, we see lower victimization, lower criminalization, lower prison rates, and better overall well-being for health and social and economic welfare. And how do we actually develop policies and practices and legislative regimes that provide a more equal starting place? So that's a very long introduction to, the journey that I've taken to get to this point, to where the work I'm doing is trying to dismantle, decolonize, decriminalize, decarcerate. But at the same time, if we just do that and don't build up community, then we may result in more people being deinstitutionalized. But if we literally release them, but don't actually change the environment to which they are then, not even integrated, but plunked into society and then are left to fend for themselves. And that will result in some other new form of institutionalization, as it has with the deinstitutionalization of health and mental health centers. And so we really need to be thinking about how we build up community, how we make a more equitable starting points for all people. And then from there, if there are individuals whose behavior goes outside the norm in a way that is harmful to other people, how do we actually provide supports, not just for those people, because of course we have to address their behavior, but also how do we provide better supports for communities as a whole? And so that's really what the work is trying to do both of those things simultaneously.
I think Canada's very lucky to have you in this policy-making role, Kim, because you've had that really on-the-ground experience at really working with people who are impacted. And I think, very sadly, too many people in positions of government who are making these laws and deciding on these policies actually just don't know and have never really listened to people who've had experience of the system, and so often make decisions based on really false claims like, the war on drugs or tough on crime. So I think you're a really fantastic example for us. You've raised concern about how Indigenous women are overrepresented in the prison system in Canada. For listeners who are new to this issue, why are they more likely to be imprisoned?
Well, the real issue is, of course, racism and misogyny and class bias. But in Canada, right now, Indigenous women are about 4 to 5% of the population, and they're 50% of the federal prison population. And in some of the provinces, like in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the Northern Three Territories, so those 5 of 13 jurisdictions, they're anywhere from 75 to 100%. And it gets even worse when you look at young women. So those who are underage, so under 18 in the youth system, they are 95 to 100% of the kids in jail are Indigenous. So it's a problem that's getting worse. Men are overrepresented as well. Indigenous men are 1 in 3 of the prison population, which is also gross and, another example of the mass incarceration. But when you realize they're 50%, when we look at women alone, then you start to look at how does that happen? Well, in almost all of the cases, the women have responded to violence or poverty. In almost all of the cases, the women are classified as higher security. In almost all of the cases, the issues that have given rise to women being criminalized are related to them trying to survive poverty and or that violence or past trauma. And they often have internalized, and please don't hear me as saying they're on them. It's not on them. But we all know how we are raised as in society to believe that if something happens to us, then somehow it's our fault. And then we get the added double whammy. We're deputized. We're told you protect yourself. But when you act to protect yourself, if you do anything that may cause harm to somebody else, then the full weight of the law will come down on you. And so you're more likely to be criminalized because you then step out of gender norms of being, feminine, not violent, and taking the abuse. I mean, think of how self-defense by women has been interpreted in our country. In 1990, the first time our Supreme Court of Canada recognized that battered women may have to fight back differently than men would fight in self-defense. The law required women to be pathologized to explain why they might respond to violence with violence. I'm sorry. How is it that we problematize the woman's behavior instead of the man's behavior? So the way that it went was a psychiatrist had to be called to give evidence about why a woman, after being abused for years and years and years, suddenly fights back. And the only explanation could be found is that she was perfect wife, perfect mother, and then suddenly snapped. So it problematized the woman's behavior, not the man. So it essentially said, for a woman to suddenly respond to violence by protecting herself or protecting others in her care, she has to be found to be crazy, pathologized. She has to be found to have a syndrome, because otherwise she would not respond. So it takes the unreasonable violence of the man or men that she had experienced over years and says, that we understand, men are violent. But when a woman fights back, we have to somehow explain it by that she went crazy on that day. So we've spent a long time also, in fact, before I was in the Senate, working on the whole issue of self-defense. And with Professor Elizabeth Sheehy at the University of Ottawa Law School, we developed a course called Defending Battered Women on Trial to help try and contextualize that, the fact that we problematize the woman's behavior. And an assault with a weapon is taken more seriously than assault without a weapon. And so a man who's choking a woman, who's bashing her to bits, who leaves her nearly dead, often has less serious charges applied than a woman who, in the process of that, might grab a hairbrush, a frying pan, a plate, a mug, or a knife and use it. She is seen as more culpable because she grabs a weapon. Yet we know that in most cases, when women engage in that kind of essentially hand-to-hand combat, they end up dead. So in these contexts, that behavior is not contextualized. And in fact, the male behavior is often explained away, and the woman is seen as more dangerous and violent. And that continues in the prison system. They're seen as higher risk.
If you haven't listened already, you might find interesting our recent episode with Harriet Wistrich on defending women who have killed in response to male violence and abuse. To shed light on the abuse, systemic injustices, and other factors that lead to women's imprisonment in Canada, Kim's office released a 2022 report detailing the injustices and miscarriage of justice experienced by 12 Indigenous women. If you are interested, you'll find a link in our show notes.
Every one of the women in this 12 women report at one point was described as the most dangerous or violent woman in one or more of the prisons in which she was held. They are women who have helped me raise my children. They are women who have been in my home. These are women who I would trust with my life. And I don't say that flippantly at all. These are women who, in the context, fought for their lives or fought for the lives of others, often their children or somebody else, a sister or a cousin. And, the full weight of the law came down on them. And that's partly why we're trying to get a review of all of their cases together to show these thematic themes, that they were all in residential school, all had histories of abuse, all of them were responding to the violence at first perpetrated against them All of them then got classified as higher security. All of them had trouble getting out. Some of them are serving life sentences, and 2 were sentenced to indeterminate sentences, one of which has been overturned. And I'm hoping we get some justice for them before they die. Now, one has already died, and another one, Tona, is dying. And so those thematic issues need to be unpacked. And from the limited knowledge I have of meeting with folks like you and others around the world, is that this is true in every jurisdiction when it comes to women.
What Kim is saying is true. Women around the world often receive unfair trials that do not take into consideration systemic injustices. One such woman is Tona Mills, an Indigenous woman whose story has inspired a proposed legislation to end solitary confinement. I wanted to bring you back to this really important law that you're trying to pass, Tona's law. Could you tell us about when you first met Tona in prison? It sounds like she really impacted you personally, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Mm-hmm. I first met Tona when she was 19, and she was in, it wasn't her first time in jail, but she was in jail for break and entering into, I think it was a school or an education location. She was there because she had nowhere else to go and had fled the place she had been staying. She was adopted out. She'd gone looking for her birth parents. And when she found her birth father, he said that Tona reminded him of her mother, who, by the way, he had impregnated when she was 14. And so Tona didn't know all of the details of this yet at that time, but said that she could stay with him and his partner and children. And so she stayed, but he then proceeded to start raping her. And when she couldn't take it anymore, even though she had nowhere to go, she broke into a place, and that's how she ended up in prison the time that I met her. And each of the times she was in prison, it was something like that. It was where she was trying to escape a horrific situation, and basically in desperation broke into this place, was criminalized for it, went into prison. They strip searched her. She fought back. And it was an accumulation of charges over time, where she just kept accumulating more and more charges and spending more and more time in isolation. She was transferred all over the country and at different times. We managed at one point to, because she had been left naked in a cell and was was asking for psychiatric help, the psychologist in the prison said she was just faking, that she was just trying to get attention. She was absolutely trying to get attention, but she was also losing her mind. And I watched over the course of that decade as she literally lost her mind in prison. When she was in what was often referred to as the infamous prison for women, which was the first federal penitentiary for women in Canada. When she was in there, they would keep her chained to the floor, chained to the bed. When we argued that she was being denied her basic entitlements to fresh air and access to programs, they created a special cage for her where they would lock her outside in what was essentially like a small dog cage. And then when we managed to convince them to try and let her have access to some programming, she was brilliant, and some educational programming. The only way they would allow it is if she was chained to the floor out in an open area so she could work on a computer. And they created a special room for her because I insisted on meeting with her without restraints. Everybody else met with her and she was fully shackled when she'd meet with people. In fact, I spoke about it at the last speech I did about this bill. They talked about, the correction said there was only one idiot stupid enough to agree to meet with her, and they created a special door so they could take the shackles off of her once she was in the room, in the cell space. And they said there was only one, the only idiot who was willing to meet with her. And that idiot, as I've often said, was me. I went in and they would watch us on camera, and we were working on an advocacy plan for her, actually, and how to get her out of there and into appropriate support setting and to try and get her out of prison. And through that process, I mean, it was interesting. Tona is now terminally ill. She has cancer. And just last week, I took my children, my son, who is 34, Michael, and Madison, who's 26, have known Tona since they were very young. And in fact, the first visit Madison had with Tona, she was just a few months old, and Tona made her a special blanket. And I had forgotten she even had pictures of those times. She'd asked the institution to allow, there's often in prisons an institutional camera, and you can pay, and she paid to have photos taken while we're there. And so we were looking at those photos, and it was fascinating and heartbreaking and also heartwarming to hear my kids talk about the importance of her. And, she used to pretend she was the Easter bunny, and she would call me up Easter morning and say, what did you get the kids? And so I'd tell her, and then she'd call and say she was the Easter bunny calling, did you like this and this? And did you like that? Or, how many of the 20 chocolates did you find? All that kind of thing. And when she got out of prison, at first, before she was taken back in, and that time we managed to get her into the mental health setting, because it was a situation where she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, had a bit of a psychotic break. And the police, to their credit, who called me, I asked them to document everything. And so she went into the mental health system that time. Otherwise, she might still be in segregation, or may have died in segregation. And when she was getting out, the first thing she did, and we had some other pictures. In fact, I have one of those pictures on my desk at the Senate, in my office at the Senate, picture of her getting out of prison when Michael was 12. So you can do the math. That's 22 years ago. And they both remember the first thing Tona said is, I said, what do you need to be successful when you get out? And, had she not had the psychotic break, she might have stayed out then. But she said, I'd really like to hang out with Michael for a week. And so I talked to Michael. I said, what do you think about going out? And we went camping. We did, hung out and did some things, celebrated her birthday. Her birthday was that week. And these are individuals who have, we often say it takes a village to raise children. And I was a single mom for a fair bit of the time I was raising those kids, but they've had the privilege and responsibility of knowing many of these women.
Thank you so much for sharing Tona's story, Kim. And I'm so sorry for just all she went through. It's just such a painful story to hear, and just really tragic that, because she was detained in solitary confinement for so long, so brutalized, that she now has isolation-induced schizophrenia. And I think it's important to point out for listeners that this doesn't just happen in Canada, that research shows in many countries, excessive solitary confinement is often used against Indigenous women and women of colour, such as in Australia, New Zealand, and in the US. And I think solitary confinement, as you kind of so painfully explained with Tona's story, is particularly harmful to women who've experienced trauma. And again, why I continue to just say that, prison is not a safe space for women, and it continues to re-traumatize women who are often extremely traumatized. And that's like the basis that leads them into prison. Tona Mills spent over a decade in federal custody, much of it in solitary confinement, sometimes for months at a time. The isolation caused severe psychological harm, including what experts have described as isolation-induced schizophrenia. Tona's law was created in response to her experience. The bill seeks to end the overuse of solitary confinement by requiring judicial approval if someone is held in a structured intervention unit for more than 48 hours. It also mandates hospital transfers for people with serious mental health conditions and provides legal remedies for those whose confinement or parole was unfairly impacted by isolation. The Senate passed Tona's law in December 2024, and it now awaits consideration in the House of Commons. The bill also emphasises community-based alternatives aiming to prevent imprisonment.
It chronicles really the areas of racism, misogyny, the ways the system responded to her, and how it generated mental health issues, and then how it penalized and criminalized her even more so every time she fought back against, whether it was strip searched, whether it was being forcibly injected, whether it was being segregated, and many other issues. As we're speaking now, about 40, I think we're up to 45 senators have gone into the prison. So you start to see the change, and hence the reason these provisions passed again in law. And my hope is that they will again pass in this session.
We really hope that this law will pass, Kim. It's such an important law, and it's a great example, not just for Canada, but for the rest of the world. So we'll be following really keenly. But I think this point you mentioned about how important it is for senators, government officials to go into prison is one that I always try to encourage around the world. I think when government officials can actually experience prison for themselves, then they're in a much better place to understand and to actually try and make policies that are actually much more community centered. One example from my own country in Zambia is our current president in opposition was imprisoned, and he was in Mukabeko, the maximum security prison in Zambia, which is also where people on death row were housed. And actually, one of the first things he did when he was elected as president was to abolish the death penalty. And I think it's because of that proximity. And so I think for listeners who are working in this space, a really key thing is to work with people in government and to take them to prisons, or to kind of help to facilitate them to meet people who've been formerly incarcerated, and to really listen to these stories, such as the one you mentioned of Tona, who, suffered so much.
Well, thank you for raising. I did not know that example. Actually, please send more details about it, because I would love to use that example in our parliament as well, because I often use the example of Nelson Mandela, who, as everybody knows, was jailed for 29 years and one of the first acts of parliament he did was to, he recognized the impact of incarceration on families, not just the individual who's incarcerated. And I agree, it's really important. To a senator, everyone who has gone in the prison, including incredibly conservative senators, have said how shocked they are by, one, who they meet, two, what they say, and three, what the results of incarceration are. There are, of course, anomalies, but in most cases, judges think that the person is going somewhere where they're going to have supports to deal with the issues that brought them there in the first place. And I think judges, members of parliament, and senators are shocked when they go into jails and realize that isn't usually the priority, that at best it's warehousing, and at worst it's actually creating further inequities and creating additional problems and making it harder for people to ever integrate successfully in the community in the future.
Absolutely. And I think this is especially true for women, that prison is often more re-traumatizing and very painful for women. It's often not a safe space for women. Many people speak about prison abolition, which can be confusing to people new to this issue. What does prison abolition mean to you? And practically, what would it look like for women?
Well, I often talk about the decolonization, decriminalization, and decarceration of the system, as well as then the development of community so that people have supports to prevent them from being criminalized. And where we don't succeed, and I say we because it's on us, if we don't succeed in preventing people from being criminalized, then we have a responsibility to set up communities to welcome them back in a way that's safe for everybody, including them, to be back in community. So when we're talking about Indigenous people, that means clean water, adequate housing. It means accessible education. It means all of those things, which we don't have in Canada. Many people don't know that. We have, on many First Nations reserves and communities in this country, the living conditions are worse than many developing countries. So that's the kind of thing we need to be addressing. And, oftentimes I'll say these are not new ideas. When our ancestors came to North America, there weren't jails there. And so we have developed processes where we criminalize and incarcerate, and we need to work with those communities to decarcerate. And in fact, one of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was that within a decade, the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples needed to be addressed. Now, that decade is this year. The end of that decade is this year. And so I asked a question before we rose for the summer in our Senate. I asked the government, what's their plan? If you haven't built up community, you're just setting people up to be in a vicious cycle right back into the system. So I say it not to be flippant, but to really make the point that if we truly want to achieve these results, we have to work to develop the supports in communities so that people can thrive, not survive, not just barely make it through. And it's beyond me how so many people do get out and thrive, because the conditions are so punishing and so challenging. The biggest likelihood is that people will end up just back in the system because of a lack of supports. And it's thanks to them, their resilience, their families, their communities of support, other organizations that, they don't, but still the vast number far too many do end up back in the system because of that.
I wondered if you could also talk to us a little bit more about Indigenous and community-based alternatives to incarceration. I was really fortunate last year to meet with Corey Wilson from the BC First Nations Justice Council. This was at an event that Women Beyond Walls organised with some other partners, where we were discussing drafting international principles to reduce discrimination in legal systems. And we were speaking about having alternatives to incarceration, but those which are much more rooted in community-based solutions. And I think Canada is innovating some of them. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, Corey and many others are trying to develop the models so that you can avoid people ending up in prison and then support them when they get out. And so everything from healing lodges to what we call Section 81, 84 agreements, which is what Tona's law would increase the access to in the system, and providing the kinds of supports that allow people to be held accountable in community and build and take responsibility while also contributing to the community. And so one of the women SN in our 12 Women report right now, Corey's group and some others are looking at how could they help build and provide a community of support for her to help her get out of the prison system and to integrate in the community. And her hope is to work with young people to try and help prevent what she experienced happening to more young people. And so there are individual and then there are more systemic collective approaches that are being looked at, like communities saying, in the child welfare system, we won't allow any more of our children to go into the care of the state. Each community will provide supports. And so some communities are doing things like if a child is seen as in need of protection, their home becomes designated as the protected place. And if their parents or the caregiver has to be taken out for a period of time, they can be. If in fact there need to be surrogate or supplementary care providers put in place to help model the behavior that needs to be changed or corrected or supported, then that can be done instead of spending tens of millions and billions of dollars we do right now to take those kids out of the care of their families or their communities and dislocate them.
Absolutely. And I think that if we can invest more in these community-based solutions that you're talking about and really addressing these root causes of incarceration that we've discussed on this podcast, such as racism, poverty, abuse, rather than, investing in prisons. And I think the UK is a really good example of this. In the UK, we have women's centres. So women are supported in the community to address many of these root causes that drive them into the legal system, which means they can be supported in the community. They're not separated from their children or families. And research shows that these are much more effective models. Women are much less likely to go back into prison, but also they're much more cost effective. It costs around £4,000 to support a woman in a women's centre, but £52,000 to put a woman in prison. And I think when we start looking at it that way, it helps to explain what people mean by prison abolition or kind of defund, the police or the prison system. And it's really about thinking, what are we prioritizing? Are we prioritizing these community-rooted solutions? Are we imagining or dreaming alternatives? Or are we just investing in these institutions that have just been there for years and actually research continually shows us they're not working? People who've been in prison keep telling us they're not working. So I do hope that, some of the things you're trying to push, such as universal basic income or dismantling these different parts of the system, will be effective. Thank you so much, Kim, for sharing all your expertise with us. And really, thank you very much for your work. I think it's so important in this podcast that we've shown what an important role everyone has to play, including people with lived experience, lawyers, and people who are in government, such as yourself. And I think you really inspire us through your work. And I think for me, particularly your commitment through everything you do to centre the voices of people who have been impacted and to work alongside them. So thank you for that example and that inspiration.
Thank you very much for all the work you're doing and for doing this podcast and getting this information out.
Stand up. We've got to stand up.
Thank you for listening to this season of Women Beyond Walls. We've so appreciated having you with us on this journey. Your solidarity truly matters. Women Beyond Walls is more than a podcast. We're a community taking action to end the mass incarceration of women and to amplify the voices of those creating change around the world. We'd love for you to be a part of it. Visit womenbeyondwalls.org to learn more about Senator Kim Pate, reforms to the criminal legal system, and the many ways you can get involved. You can also sign up for our newsletter, a monthly dose of inspiration, stories, and opportunities to help build a fairer, more compassionate future. And of course, to stay tuned for our next season, make sure to subscribe to the podcast. This episode is edited by Human Group Media, a podcast company for social change and impact. To learn more about their work, please visit humangroupmedia.com. On this episode, we are thankful for the assistance of Laura Cook as executive producer, and to Lady Unchained and Miri for the use of their song, which accompanies all podcast episodes in the series. If you love the song as much as we do, visit unchained.org.uk. Unchained runs an artistic mentoring platform for people with lived experience of the criminal legal system. If you enjoyed this episode of Women Beyond Walls, we encourage you to pass it on and share with friends. And if you have time, we would really appreciate your reviews on your podcast platform.